Without further ado, I'd like to invite Susan McIsaac, President and CEO of United Way Toronto, and Dr. Patrick Dean, President and Vice Chancellor of McMaster University, to the stage to open the conference.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. We are delighted to begin this dialogue with so many smart, thoughtful leaders in the room with us. So thank you one and all for joining us today. This symposium is bringing together people from all different sectors, all levels of organizations across the sectors, academics, researchers, government, community leaders, corporate leaders. And so we thank you all for coming out. Precarious employment is a serious issue facing our community. We are here today to better understand and to begin a conversation about what we can do about it. As part of our long-term strategy for building a better city, United Way conducts research to help us better understand trends influencing life in Toronto. In 2007, United Way released a report entitled Losing Ground. It raised questions about how the changing nature of the job market might be contributing to rising economic vulnerability. When United Way partnered with McMaster University on this study, we wanted to look more closely into the issue and find answers to two important questions. What is the true nature of precarious employment in our region today? And what impact is today's job market having on our lives outside of work, on our families, and on our communities? Today is the first step of many that we take together, an attempt to begin answering these two complex questions. There's a lot in the report, so we'll spend the whole day reviewing and looking for answers, hearing different and diverse perspectives. Over the course of the day, I'd also like to invite you to contribute your thoughts and ideas to the conversation online. We will be using the Twitter hashtags #PEPSO at #poverty, period. I don't give it with period, and that was just my own reading. I'm such a Twitter non-person. Many people have contributed to the excellent reports that you have in front of you. They are listed in the front of the document, but there are two individuals who have provided tremendous thought leadership and leadership overall to this research. And I do want to recognize the co-principal investigators of It's More Than Poverty. Wayne Lewchuk, there is Wayne, the professor in the School of Labor Studies and Department of Economics at McMaster University, and my colleague Micheline Laflèche, the Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation at United Way. I also wanted to acknowledge the many other people and organizations that have contributed to this important research, and you'll see in your folders that we have listed them. A broad and deep study such as this cannot be undertaken without so many people participating and contributing, and my thanks to all. I'm also really pleased that we have a couple of other individuals joining us today. I see Councillor Mihevik over there, and I'm delighted to see that you're here and a part of the dialogue. Thank you. And I haven't seen him yet, but I believe the Honourable Art Eggleton is joining us this morning. I'm not sure if he's arrived yet. But we're delighted about both of those, so welcome and thank you for joining us. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Dean, the President and Vice Chancellor of McMaster University. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the partnership that we have enjoyed with McMaster. This has been what I would describe as a very cooperative and really mutually beneficial relationship. We've benefited immensely from the work of McMaster and the team there. And I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Dean, for your leadership and support of this work. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Susan. It really is a privilege to share the podium with Susan today in recognition of our quite wonderful partnership with United Way on this project. This report, It's More Than Poverty, the report of the poverty and employment precarity in Ontario, is the fruit of a Cura grant, and now extinct species supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And this report, I think, illustrates in an excellent way just what can be achieved through this kind of a grant, through collaborations between the universities, which bring expertise, a facility with analysis, and the kind of appropriate theoretical frameworks to dealing with social problems, and community groups, which have, of course, a first-hand understanding of those challenges and problems, and also a good pragmatic sense of the framework within which solutions to those problems need to be found. So I think this report is a wonderful example of the kind of fruits that this kind of collaboration can produce. So I want to acknowledge the United Way of Toronto, partners with McMaster in leading this study. We're very proud of what has been achieved, particularly through the work of Wayne Lewchuk and his team of researchers, drawn not only from our university but from other universities, not only in Toronto and in the Greater Toronto area and in Canada, but from abroad as well as community organizations of many different kinds. So in saying all of this, I've been speaking in my capacity as president of McMaster, but I'd like to say, in closing, a few words more about this issue, speaking first as an educator and then as a citizen. So to speak first as an educator, as someone who understands that his role is to prepare young people from our communities for success in life, success construed not in simple terms, but in comprehensive terms that include good health, mental health, well-being, and a rich cultural life as well. Everyone has an opinion about what institutions of higher learning need to do to prepare young people for success in the world. This has been much discussed lately in the papers. It's an enormously complex question, but it's rendered even more complex by the fact that one of the least scrutinized questions in this whole discussion is this question: what are we preparing young people for? What is the vision of society for which they are destined? And I think this report, It's More Than Poverty, gives us a very sobering view of what that world looks like. Because it is, yes, of course, a snap taken at a particular point in time, but it is also a stage in a progression. And I think we're all concerned about the direction of that movement. Some very sobering discussion this morning on the radio in an interview with Wayne about just what this means for the quality of life for young people and what it might mean in the longer term. So as an educator, I'm really interested in that. It's all very well to say that there are particular things universities and colleges and the school system ought to be doing, but is this the world that we wish our young people to move into and inherit these kinds of employment possibilities? So that brings me to my next question, and it's the question I would ask as a citizen, which is, should we accept this situation? Is the situation, as we learn about it in this report, and day to day in dealing with young people in our community, is this a situation that is acceptable or ought to be acceptable in a society of which we want to be proud? And I think the report offers a great incentive, not only the information we need to think creatively about addressing this question, but it also prompts us to move in the direction of considering public policy decisions and other kinds of considerations that might help to reverse this trend and ensure that the world into which our young people move will be one in which they can find true happiness, defined in much richer ways than they are currently invited to experience life today. So I'm delighted to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people here to explore the ramifications of this report. And I thank you for having me, and I thank Susan for this opportunity to partner with the United Way. Now, my thanks to all of you. I'm going to yield the podium to Micheline Laflèche. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the It's More Than Poverty conference. Really delighted to see such a large crowd joining us for this event. It's a really big milestone in this project. It's the first major report of the project coming out. There'll be others to follow, and you'll hear about some of those this morning as well. Some of the case studies are going to be presenting their preliminary and some of them close to finished findings. And we'll be continuing to work over another 2 years on this project to bring more information and shed more light on the issue as we uncover more through the research. I just wanted to say something about the venue that we're in. It's the YMCA, as you all know. You've seen the swimming pool and the gym outside. We're not going to have any gym sessions, I can assure you. Maybe we should later in the afternoon, though, but I won't make you do that. But it is the YMCA, and it is a member agency of the United Way of Toronto. So we're really pleased to be able to be here in one of our agency's venue. And it was a really poignant little moment this morning when the little kids from the daycare down the hallway here came passing through. And I think you're going to be seeing them all day long passing through on the outside of this auditorium. And it's just what Dr. Dean just said about thinking about the future. And that's what we thought when we saw those little kids this morning, thinking, this research is really important because it's about their future. And we need to be thinking about how we're going to address the issues that we're facing and how we're going to do that together as a whole community, labor, business, government, and civil society. So that's what we're here to do today to get the conversation started. Launched a report, and I have the pleasure of having Wayne Lewchuk presenting the findings to you today. Wayne is the co-principal investigator, the first author on the report. Let's say he put quite a lot of work into this, above and beyond everyone else's terrific work as well. And it's thanks to him, his team, all of us who have been part of the PEPSO project, working together over many months on this report, coming to understand the data and understand what it's saying to us, that we're here today. Wayne is professor in the School of Labor Studies in the Department of Economics at McMaster University, and his research has focused for many years on the health effects of precarious employment. He recently published a volume on this subject as well called Working Without Commitments, and he has a BA and an MA in economics from the University of Toronto and a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And so with that, we're going to have Wayne present the findings for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the floor for about 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the time. So thank you all very much indeed, and Wayne, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I'm sort of somewhat overwhelmed by what's happened the last couple of days. There's been a lot of pleasure out there, but let me tell you, almost all the pleasure's been mine working with the people that I've been working with. It's really been a marvelous collaborative effort. And before I actually get into presenting the findings, I just want to take just a moment to pay respect to the people who've really inspired this. And while I may have done some of the writing, I'm quite happy to say the ideas are all everyone else's. So let me just start. So we already know that Michelin has been involved. Susan McDonnell from the United Way, she's now retired, but she really was the inspiration that got this whole engine going about 5 years ago as a result of the United Way's Losing Ground report, and she deserves a lot of the credit. I don't think she's with us today, but she deserves a lot of credit. Here at McMaster, my colleague Sam Brancoul, I think he's here. Sam, why don't you stand up? Oh, has he disappeared? Sam has been by my side all along, showed me how to use my cell phone and all of those important kinds of things. As well, Diane Dyson, I think I saw you here, Diane, back there at the back, from Wood Green Community Services, was part of this. Lewin Goldring, I know you're here, Lewin. There you are, from York University, stand up. Alan Meisner from Concom, he's what's at the City of Toronto, I know he's here. Alan, there you are. Stephanie Prusik, you've already met her. She was an integral part of this whole project. Dan Rosen from the City of Toronto. I think you're here, Dan. There you are. John Shields from Ryerson was really a part of this. Peter Vidukas from City of Toronto. He couldn't be here today. He's doing other things at the city, pushing forward the frontier. And Pedro Barada, I think he's has helped us shape. Pedro, you must be here somewhere. There he is at the back. Helped us shape these sort of final issues. So, okay, these are different slides than mine. That's perfect. Okay. Okay, so as you know, we've released a report, and really what we tried to do is we tried to look beyond what does precarious work mean for the person actually doing the work, and what does precarious work mean for people's families and for our community. And in some ways this reflects my own background as an economic historian, so I fully understand the kind of families and the kind of communities that were developed in places like Windsor, where I grew up, and in places like Hamilton, where I took my first job, were really shaped by the kind of employment that people could get in large companies that was full-time and permanent. And so the question is, well, what's happening as those kind of jobs become less common? And I think this quote on the screen is really indicative of what people are telling us, that it's changing them as people. It's changing the kinds of community that we live in, and I think we need to ask some serious questions about whether or not that's the direction that we want to go. So the study itself was, we did a random population survey of 4,000 people. Leger Marketing did that for us. The survey area covers everything from Hamilton in the west to the northern boundary of the GTA to Whitby. And as well as the 4,000 people who generously, when they picked up the phone, agreed to take 20 minutes to talk to us, and I think we have to thank those folks. Another 83 people agreed to sit down with us and discuss their experience as precarious workers in some detail. One of the issues I think that's really quite critical is, how do we measure precarious employment? How do we know when people are in insecure employment? And you know, poverty has its own challenges of measuring it, but it's a whole lot easier. You can just measure how much money did people make, and you can get a sense of poverty. You can ask them certain questions that get a sense of pressure on their budget. But when we're talking about employment insecurity and precariousness, it's much more difficult. And we use two different ways of measuring that precarity. I just want to spend a moment so that everyone sort of understands how we've pulled the rabbit, so to speak, out of the data hat. One way to measure precariousness is really by the form of the employment relationship. So, are you in a full-time permanent job? Are you employed through a temp agency? Are you on a 6-month contract? Are you self-employed but without any employees? That's own account self-employment. So we look at actually the form of the employment relationship. And you can get relatively good data on that, but the problem is that's going to miss a number of things. So there are a number of people who are self-employed on account who feel quite secure in where they are, so they don't see themselves as precarious. On the other hand, there are people who are in permanent full-time jobs who told us they're very precarious. And so we needed a second way of getting at the levels of insecurity in our community. And in order to do that, we developed what's called the Employment Precarity Index. And this is basically a set of 10 questions which we ask people, and we use those questions to divide our sample between those who are in secure jobs and those people who are in precarious jobs. And their scores on that index basically allowed us to do the analysis that we did. And this is just to sort of give you an idea of the kinds of questions that we asked. We asked people, are you paid if you miss work? And it might be of interest to some people that 20 years ago, in 1991, basically 2/3 of people in Ontario were paid if they missed work. They didn't lose pay. Today, it's less than half are paid if they miss work. So just one indicator of the precarity that's happening out there in terms of people's income insecurity. We asked them if they were in a permanent full-time job with benefits that they expected to have in a year. We asked them about whether their hours were stable, whether their income was stable, whether they could raise an issue with their workplace and not be worried about losing their jobs, whether they're on-call workers. If they were paid in cash, if you're paid in cash, there's a certain vulnerability. You don't have any record of your pay, and it's quite easy to make mistakes, and certainly we found a lot of mistakes, and not surprisingly there was a bias in terms of which side of the ledger those mistakes were on. So we take that index and we start scoring people's employment relationships. And just to give you an idea of what that might look like. So let's suppose you were a temp agency worker. Well, you're almost certainly not paid if you miss your work. You're not in a permanent full-time job with benefits. Your weekly income is not stable. Your hours are not stable. You don't know your work schedule in advance. You may get called Tuesday night about your work schedule on Wednesday. You're certainly in temporary employment. You're afraid to raise issues at the workplace because then you may not get renewed. Your contract may not get renewed. So on the index, this person might score as high as 80 out of 100 on this index, which would put them in the precarious group. What's not part of the index, and this is really quite an important point, is it's not income. It's not a part of this index. We look at income as one indicator. We look at precarity as another. And that resulted, I think, in some really quite surprising findings. We could look at other occupations as well. So child care worker. Again, this is probably someone who's not making much more than $30,000. But these people, maybe they are, maybe they aren't paid if they miss work, but they're in a permanent job. They probably have some benefits. They expect to be there probably in a year. Their weekly income is probably stable, low but stable. Their hours are stable. They probably don't work on call. They're probably not paid in cash. It's a formal employment relationship. They may have some benefits. They may be a little bit cautious of voicing concerns at work. So it probably scores only maybe about 10 out of 100 on the scale. And so this is someone who would have secure but low income. So you can have low income insecure, and you can have low income secure. From the perspective of what we're finding, perhaps the more interesting group are those who are sort of these middle-income individuals. So individuals making between $50,000 and $100,000. And they can be both secure and insecure as well. And so at the university, we have a lot of contract researchers. These are people on time-defined contracts. They only have jobs as long as the research grant runs. And so for these people, they can be precarious, but also middle income. So we could score them and say, there's a lot of insecurity in your position. You don't know whether you're going to have a job down the road. And so they can be well paid, but not necessarily have the kind of security that one might have had in the past if you worked for Stelco or Ford or Chrysler, or if you were lucky enough to get a tenured faculty position like I have. And finally, you can be precarious and high income. So you can be a consultant pulling in all kinds of money, but there also can be all kinds of precarity associated with that. So if you miss work as a consultant, guess what? You don't get paid. You're not in a permanent job with benefits. You're on your own. You find your own employment. Your weekly income is probably not stable, so some weeks you could be making lots of money. Some weeks you could be making no money. So hours, some weeks you're working 80, 90 hours. Next week you're working 4 or 5 hours. So all this adds up. And so this person can be, in some ways, just as precarious as a temp agency worker. But they're in a different income bracket, and that brings different problems. And so what we've done is we've used these two different ways of measuring precarity to try and get a handle on what's going on in our households and in our communities. So I think the first, and in some ways the point that has caught a lot of media attention, is that of people between the ages of 25 and 65, so we've dropped new entrants to the labor market. These are not students that we're looking at. We've dropped people who might be in a post-retirement kind of position, working part-time or in a temporary job. This is people 25 to 65. Only half told us, I have a permanent job that pays benefits that I expect to be in a year. Right? And the other half are in something else. About another 10% told us, I'm in a permanent job, but it's part-time, and I expect it to go on. But it's not a full-time job. So about 60% have some degree of stability in their employment relationship. The other 40% are somewhere else. Of those, about 20% are employed through a temp agency. They're on 6-month contracts, their own account, self-employed, consultants, etc. And another 20%, many of these can be in full-time jobs, but they're not being paid any benefits, so they get a wage but no benefits. There's no pension. They're not sure if they're going to have that job in a year. And so they're in sort of this gray area between the temp agency worker and the permanent full-time worker with some stability. So probably as many as 40% of our sample have some degree of precarity built into their relationship. One of the other findings of the report, I just want to stress this, is this notion that the precarity is everywhere. It's moved into socioeconomic groups and income levels that previously were sort of immune from this. So it's certainly found in low-income groups. It's certainly found amongst immigrants, people of color, etc., women. But it's also increasingly being found in middle-income groups, amongst men who formerly had access to privileged jobs, and those privileged jobs are simply disappearing. One of the things that we know from the study now is that people in precarious employment, they face a lot of uncertainty. In some ways, it's that uncertainty that I think is having these effects into our community, into our households, that are creating various kinds of tensions. And here I'm going to refer to a number of the figures that are actually in the report. I'm just going to touch on a few. I won't go through all 60. I'm sure you're thanking me for that. But I will go. So we'll skip right to number 18, which looks at income variability from week to week. And what you can see, this simply divides our sample into the 25% of our sample who scored the highest on our precarity index, and the 25% of the sample that scored the lowest. So I'm in the secure group. I have a 10-year job at McMaster. Thank you, President Dean. But a lot of other people, I suspect many in this room, are in this precarious group. They don't have the security. And certainly all the media people I've been talking to, they get it right away. They say, that's me you're talking about. I'm in that precarious group. I understand exactly what you're saying. And for those people in this precarious group, you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty about their future income. Almost 40% say there's a lot of insecurity. I don't know what my future income is going to look like. And so you can imagine, how does that bleed into your household? When your child says, I'd like to go to camp, or I'd like to do some after-school activity, or you need to fix the roof, or you need a new car, or you're thinking about increasing your mortgage. All these things become more difficult if you don't know what your income flow is. There's also tremendous problems scheduling, figure 22. So people in precarious employment don't know their schedule. So again, imagine 40% of people in this lower tier don't know what their schedule is from week to week. How do you plan daycare? How do you plan activities for your family? One young person says, how do I plan sex when I don't know what my work schedule is? So there's all kinds of problems associated with this kind of insecurity, which is a very rare thing for people who are in secure employment. As I said, the main focus of the study is to look at what does this mean for individuals, for families, and for community life. And here, I think the findings are really somewhat disturbing. So it's not just that I have this insecurity of not knowing what my income is going to be as a worker. It's not just, as I've studied in the past, this raises health and safety problems at work. There's also the whole issue of what does it mean for my family? What does it mean for my ability to be part of my community? And the first figure here, this is figure 41. In some ways, this was our aha moment when we revealed this. And again, let me just sort of spend a moment saying, what are you looking at? Here, what we've done is we've tried to look at the impact of employment insecurity and different levels of household income separately. So we began by taking our employment precarity index, and we divided our sample into half. The half in the more insecure jobs, the half in the more secure jobs. So we were looking at the whole sample at half and half. And then we divided the sample into 3 different household income groups. So households making less than $50,000, households making $50,000 to $100,000, and households making over $100,000. So we end up with 6 cells, which allows us to look at low income and insecure, low income and secure, middle income, insecure, middle income and secure, and high income insecure, high income secure. This figure asks, well, does your employment situation create anxiety that interferes with personal and family life? So we're really drilling down. What does this mean for your family? What does it mean for individuals that you're associated with? I don't think we were at all surprised that if you're in a low income and insecure group, I'm not sure I have a light here. But here, down here at the bottom, basically 25% of those people say, yes, anxiety about my job often interferes with my household relationships. And only a third could say it never interferes. So at least 2/3, there's often some anxiety. And for a quarter, it's a regular event. Again, somewhat surprising, as we move into the secure but low income, there's less of this problem. These are people who have jobs that are $30,000, $40,000 a year. They maybe have some benefits, they maybe have a small pension, and they expect to have that job making $30,000 or $40,000 a year again next year, and probably the year after that. So they have some security moving forward. There's actually less anxiety there for these folks than the low income insecure. But perhaps what was the most surprising is we move up one more column to the insecure middle income group. So these are people who are in the bottom half of our security index. They're often not getting paid if they miss work. They don't know if they're going to have a job in a year. They could be on-call workers. They could be temporary workers. But they're paid relatively well. For them, on some of the indicators, they actually show up being worse than people in the secure low income. There's actually more problems for this group than there were for the low-income insecure. Not more problems than for the low-income insecure, but more problems than for the low-income secure. And what this is saying is that certainly we need higher minimum wages. We need to find a way to get more money into low-income families' households. That's a given. But we also need to figure out how to make that income more secure. Simply raising minimum wages and leaving people uncertain if they're going to have a job in a month is not necessarily a solution. We need to understand that insecurity itself is having a drag on our households and a drag on our communities. One of the things that we found quite surprising is that this is also having an effect on household formation and whether people decide to have children. And again, particularly for low-income insecure and middle insecure households, they're delaying having children. So these are people who are making $60,000, $70,000 as a household income. They're saying, yeah, well, I could probably afford to have kids, but if I have children, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get back into the labor market. I don't have a sort of a permanent attachment to employment, or my partner doesn't have that permanent attachment, and so we're delaying having households. It's not that they can't afford to have children, or it's not that they don't want to have children. They simply are not certain, not sufficiently confident about their income in order to move forward in that direction. And this bleeds into all kinds of things: buying houses, increasing the size of your house, taking vacations, etc. All the uncertainty of your income has an effect on these things. Okay, my apologies. The good advice of the United Way said we should take these slides off, but as an academic, bullheaded. I think this is actually a very important slide here because it's telling us something that's quite different from our assumptions about precarious employment and households. I think this standard that we think of, well, one person's out there with a great job with benefits and a pension, and the other person is in some part-time work. They really don't need the job; they're supplementing the income, and the household is fine. What we have actually found is that's not the norm. The norm is if one person in the household is in precarious employment, probably the other person is also in precarious employment. So this is a chart where just the men that we surveyed, we asked them, what about your partner? What kind of employment do they have? And so if the male is in this precarious group, so they have insecure employment, they're in the bottom quarter of the index, 30% of their partners are not employed for pay. They don't have any pay. Whereas you look at the secure group, only about 20% are not employed. So number one, if you're in insecure employment, it's more likely your partner has no employment. But equally important, if I'm in insecure employment, then it's also quite less probable that my partner has a permanent job or employed full-time. So only just over 40% of the partners of men in the study were in full-time employment. That compares with almost 60% of the partners of men who were in secure employment. So what we're seeing, for a number of reasons, if I'm in insecure employment, that makes it more difficult for my partner to take on employment or for my partner to take on full-time employment. And I think that's really quite a critical finding. This is the same data for women. The women in the study, it's a little bit less pronounced, but the tendency is exactly the same direction. So what does this mean for children? What does this mean for raising kids when you have this kind of precarious employment? Well, this is a chart which asks, because a number of questions here, figure 46. What about buying school supplies and clothing for children? And here what we see, certainly low income has an impact. This is most often a problem in low income households. But having low income and insecure employment compounds the problem. So almost 10% of those people in low income and insecure employment say that most of the time I can't do this, compared to just less than 5% of those people in low income and secure employment. So again, the insecurity is compounding the problem of having low income. Certainly one of the issues that came out quite strongly is this issue of daycare. And I think this comes back to the early comment about why, if I'm in insecure employment, my partner has trouble getting a full-time employment. if you're in insecure employment, you don't know what your schedule is going to be, you don't know if you're going to have a job in 3 months, how do you arrange daycare? I mean, daycare they would like a commitment for a week, and a 5-day daycare and over an entire year. And also, by the way, daycare is during the day, and so if your next job happens to be evening work, how do you solve that for your children, or weekend work, etc. And so what we saw is for those people who are in insecure employment, whether they're in low-income households or middle-income households, finding appropriate daycare really is a nightmare. And I suggest that that's a social issue that we just need to grapple with, and it'll open up opportunities for people who are now working in this new labor market where many jobs are insecure. What about our communities? What does this mean for participating as a citizen in our society and engaging with friends and with people? And here the findings, to Frank, are complex. There are many different reasons why people engage in community. One of the surprising results is that in some ways, insecure employment, at least for women, seems to actually facilitate community participation. And in fact, some of the women that we talked to said to us, look, I'm not willing to commit to a full-time permanent job that ties me to a desk 5 days a week, because I do want to engage in my child's school. I want to engage in other kinds of community activity. So women in insecure employment, at all income levels, were the most likely to be volunteering 20 or more hours a month. So it's almost a day a week. And I think that was a surprising finding. Certainly my expectation was that if you're in insecure employment, you don't know your schedule, well, you can't coach your kids' ball team because you can't commit to Wednesday nights. You can't commit to a neighborhood group that meets on Thursday evenings, etc., because you never know what your schedule is. And there are certainly some people that are like that, but I said that the picture is somewhat more complex than perhaps that we thought it would be. On the other hand, if we look at a more personalized type of engagement, so this is engagement with friends. Do you have friends to do things with? I mean, here there certainly seems to be a relationship between insecure employment and that kind of socializing, particularly for men. Again, there's a lot of data here. I refer you to 61. You can look at this over lunch. But basically what it's saying here is that for men, being in insecure employment, if you're in a low-income household or a middle-income household, almost halves the possibility that you're going to have a friend you can do things with. So there's more isolation sense. I don't have a permanent job. Maybe there's some embarrassment there that you don't have a permanent job, and so you're not able to socialize as much. It's interesting for women, this is less of an effect, and I suggest you in part this is because women have been living with precarious employment for 40 years, and so they've probably developed some mechanisms to help them out with this. But for men, obviously this is a real dilemma as they move from permanent to insecure employment. So what do we do? Well, hopefully this is the beginning of a discussion in terms of how we move forward. I've sort of stressed in what I've been doing over the last couple of days that I don't think we're going back to the 1970s. In some ways, I think that's probably a good thing. Those of us who are lucky enough to have permanent full-time jobs, that's not exactly nirvana either. There are some downsides having that kind of a permanent commitment. Certainly the model of the 1970s left a lot of people out, gave privilege to some people, but left an awful lot of people out. So the question is, how do we move forward? Here's the labor market we've got. Here's the reality. Here's what it's doing. How do we move forward? I think one thing we can ask is are there ways we can actually reduce the prevalence of precarious employment? Are there things that we can do to encourage employers, to incentivize them? You can tell I'm an economist. How do you incentivize them to actually give permanent employment? Right now, the fashion is they need labor market flexibility, and I think that's having some issues. But beyond that, if more and more people are going to be in these kinds of insecure jobs, and there's some upside to having this kind of flexibility, there's no doubt about it. The question is, how do we mitigate its negative effects? Right now, I think we have the problem where the employers have all the gain from flexibility, and certainly we're becoming a richer society as a result of that, but many of the costs are being borne by the people who have been, I'm not sure this is a word, but they've been flexibilized. So they're bearing the cost of this, and I think we need to think about how do we sort of mitigate some of the social effects, how do we support families, how do we support communities. And so we've sort of thought about three broad types of policies that we might want to be thinking about. One is, what can we do to ensure that jobs are a pathway to to income and employment security. So should there be a limit in terms of how many contracts you can have as an employer? I just got an email this morning from someone from a manufacturing firm working up in Alliston and saying, I've been on contracts now for 7 years. I'm doing okay. I'm probably, when I'm employed, I'm making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, but I never know from month to month whether I'm going to have another job or have my job. And so I'm reluctant to buy a house, etc. So what can we do to say to that person, look, you've been here for 7 years. Maybe you should have some kind of security now. I think the whole issue of training is a massive one. This is something we should all be concerned about. In the 1960s and 1970s, we basically allocated to employers responsibility for identifying young people, training them up so they could move into middle jobs in the organization or upper level jobs, or maybe go from the post office or become the CEO. Employers are less willing to do that. Why would they do that if they have temp workers, if people on 6-month contracts? So how do we train our young people so that they get the kinds of skills they need so they can move into middle-level jobs? And finally, enhancing social and community supports. It's criminal that more and more households are not able to, say, fund after-school activities or provide something for their kids during the summer, or buy pencils and backpacks that their kids need. So, what kind of policies do we need to alleviate those kinds of problems? I think that families that are facing. How do we find ways to allow people to be engaged, socialized, to participate fully as citizens in our community if they've lost control over their employment schedules? And I think that's it. Okay, there we are. And so we're back to here. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Wayne? Is that working? Great. Good. Now I'm pleased to say we have an opportunity for a good 25 minutes at least for questions from the floor. Or comments as well, and engagement and discussion at this point. Wayne and I have been doing a few briefings over the last couple of weeks in preparation for the launch of this report, and we've encountered a lot of challenging questions that have really made us stop and think, and I'm sure that's going to be the case again today. But I wanted to say just one thing that I failed to say in my introduction, to remind us all that we got to this work because of our member agencies, actually. Susan said in her introduction that this project emerged from the United Way report called Losing Ground in 2007. And it was in the research for that report that Susan McDonnell was leading at the time that our member agencies were telling us that precarious work is creating problems for households and families in Toronto at that point. And it was, what we didn't have was the data to be able to back that anecdotal evidence up. We didn't have the StatsCan data to be able to do that. There wasn't other institutional or administrative data that allowed us to really shine a light on that issue that the member agencies, from their experience on the ground with their stakeholders and clients, were telling us was the case. So we engaged in this research, and I think we're really pleased to be here today to be able to change that situation and thank the member agencies for the barometer check that they offered all of us to be able to get to where we are today. So with that, I'm going to open it to questions from the floor. I think we'll take 3 at a time so that Wayne has some time to engage with each of the questions and think about them as they're coming up. And there's 2 roving mics, which I can't see because there's lights in my eyes. And where are the roving mics? One's there, one's back there. So I see one hand up back here, so I can't actually see people either. So if you could speak to the mic, because this is being recorded. So if someone could run quickly to our first speaker over here. Please say who you are and where you're from, and make your question or comment, and then we'll move on to the next 2. And people could indicate in the meantime so I can identify you.
Thank you very much. My name is Joe Mihevik, City of Toronto. I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of government. Over the last couple of years at the City of Toronto, we have contracted out our mostly janitors and cleaning people. It's funny how it happens at the most vulnerable folks in the City of Toronto workforce. We've contracted out our police stations, janitorial work. We've contracted out TTC buses, and also many public facilities. So they've gone from a wage of something like $22 an hour down to contracted out something around 13 or even less minimum wage. And the argument that is used is that this is about efficiency, and the outsourcing is about efficiency and managing a very tax-sensitive environment. I'm wondering whether you have any comments on the role of government, the role of the state, in being a potential pathbreaker towards restoring some kind of clarity around precarious employment.
Okay. And I saw Rana, could you put your hand up again? Mahela? In the middle. Someone grab the mic off the podium.
Rana Sarkar from the Monk School of Global Affairs and the Canadian Business Council. Quick question. From the data, did you get a sense whether precarity is multi-generational as well? Or is there an indication that it transfers across generations? It's also, what in your research indicated the pathway to employment in a full-time capacity for people who are precarious? Do people who start as precarious workers early in their career end their careers as precarious workers?
Okay, and there was one more right up here. Yes, Senator Eggleton. Jeanette is running right behind you to get the mic.
One of the Art Eggleton, Senate. One of the other words that is cropping up more and more in our society is underemployment, particularly as it relates to people graduating from school who are having a hard time getting into the jobs for which they were trained to do. So they end up going to restaurants and other kinds of employment on a temporary basis, struggling to pay off much higher debts for their education than any generation has experienced before. And they're also facing a real estate market and costs of living and debt levels that are higher than they've experienced before. So it leads them to precarious employment, but it also leads them to delaying getting on with their life. And it's a concern about a whole generation that is not going to do as well as many have in the past. So how do you see underemployment related also to precarious employment?
Thank you. Wayne, do you want to have a couple of those three?
Is this working? Okay. Just a reminder, this is just one little survey, so we may not have the answers to everything, but let's have a go at some ideas here. I think, Joe, the role of government. I think the 1990s and the first decade of this century, the mantra has been labor market flexibility, that employers need flexibility. And we see that at the city. I have to admit, we've seen the same thing at the university. We've seen this in Hamilton City. We've seen this in various organizations. And yeah, actually, I think it's unfortunate that janitors and those people at the very bottom, the most vulnerable, in some ways have borne the biggest cost of this flexibility. And certainly one would wish that these kind of employers would do something different and would provide more permanent employment, set a standard. But I think that it's not just at the level of public employees. I think this has to spread further into, well, I was taking coffee orders here. I think Tim Hortons would be one place where they could be offering, more permanent employment, etc. So there are a lot of other employers. So I think what we need to do is we need to change the management dialogue. Because actually, as an economist, I think this is not a great way to organize society. I think that there's all kinds of problems with this precarity. I don't think we get the productivity and the wealth creation out of people that we could have. And so I think we need to start that dialogue. There's actually a better way to do things than to have these kind of precarious jobs everywhere. Ron, you asked about multi-generational. We just don't have that kind of data. I think it's an interesting question. All we can say is that within the household, if one person's precarious, it seems the other person's precarious. So, but whether this is multi-generational, I think is an interesting question. Certainly, one would suspect that if households with precarious employment are having trouble providing for their kids today, then that's going to have a knock-on effect to the next generation. So I think that would be a hypothesis that would be worth exploring. We don't actually have that data. Do people transition from insecure employment to permanent employment? Well, so, we don't have evidence of that because it's not panel data, so we can't track people over time. But certainly the evidence out there is that, yeah, sure, some people do make that transition, but it's taking longer. So, maybe 20 years ago you started in a precarious job. By 25 you had a permanent job. Now it may not be until you're 35 that you have a permanent job. And unfortunately, by the time you're 45, they may be getting ready to get rid of you from the labor market. Whereas before you were there until you were 55. So that period when you get secure employment could be shrinking at both ends. And I think that has some interesting social implications as well. Art was asked about the issue of underemployment, and absolutely right, that just because people can't find jobs, they're being forced into these temporary jobs through temp agencies. And I think it's a massive social issue. I'm not sure that we have right now the answers to that, but I think it's something that we need to be thinking about, absolutely.
Great, thank you. So I see Dina at the front, and then we'll go Dina at the front here.
Hi, I'm Dina Ladd with the Workers' Action Centre. I think what's been really interesting about the results of the study is how it's really sort of revealed the economic and the social cost to our communities, right, around precarious work. And I think that the sort of direction for the fact that the way that we need to tackle some of these problems, I think you've outlined sort of 3 broad areas, and I think it's very much right to say it's not just about trying to raise people's income. I think that's an integral part of dealing with the low wages, but I think all the ways in which we have to rebuild our protection at work, I think, is quite critical in terms of employment standards. I think a conversation around how to make current jobs good jobs. I think that we can't just say that it's inevitable that we're going to have, a service industry and that's going to be the dominant industry, and if all those jobs happen to be 20 hours a week and with no benefits, then that's okay, right? I think that we know that there's corporations out there that regularly give people shifts of 20 hours a week so that they don't get benefits. How do we try to start to look at legislation that says that secure jobs, stable jobs, underemployment is not the way to go for our communities, but that requires, I think, real concerted coming together of groups such as those in this room to sort of say that, our communities deserve a better quality of life at work. And if it's a service sector job, as you said, Wayne, like a Tim Hortons job, why can't that job be paying a decent salary? Why can't that job have benefits? Why can't that job be 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week? Why does it have to be 15 hours? And then the schedule changed from every single week. So I think it means that we as communities need to rebuild our power to ensure that we have access to these decent jobs. And I think that that's a really critical thing that I think arises out of your study, that's a path that we need to take.
Thank you. Mihaela, right behind you.
Steve Schallhorn from the Labour Education Centre, which is a project of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. My question is about temporary work and temp agencies. I was wondering if you've looked at any potential legislative remedies for misuse of the role of temp agencies. They're only a part of temporary work, but they're one of the more insidious, I would argue, because a portion of what should be the workers' wages is going to this agency. And I noticed the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, Lane, has started to advocate a requirement that after a certain period of time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, that a requirement that your boss be your employer as a way of getting around temp agency. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, whether or not you think that might be appropriate for Ontario.
And third comment. Should be on the speaker control.
Hello, Andrew Longeau. I'm a lawyer and a grad student at York University. My question is in terms of the scope of the study from age 25 up to age 64. The critical period, let's say from age 16 up until age 24, can you maybe speak to why that wasn't included in the scope of the study? Because my concern is precarity is it's something that young people are experiencing, and do we need another study after this one to look at the specific issues that youth are facing in the school-to-work transition?
Okay, let me start with Dina and this issue of we do need to change the dialogue. I think we do need to demand changes in how we work. One of the points I've made is that the reality is that per person, our society is richer today than it was a year ago. A year ago, it was richer than it was 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, it was richer than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it was a whole lot richer than when I was a young person growing up in Windsor, and a lot of people had permanent full-time jobs with benefits. So it's not that we can't afford to be different. We just have chosen not to be different. I think what we have to decide is more clear how to share the productivity gains that we've had. And that can come through better enforcement of labor regulations, giving people an opportunity to have voice at work, etc. And I think in case employers where they're providing these short hours jobs, well then maybe there should be a wage penalty attached to that. So Australia says, well, fine, if you want to employ someone on a short-term contract, fine, you pay the minimum wage plus another 20%. And so I think that would be one way of moving a number of jobs into a more permanent sphere. So I think it's a question about choices, and hopefully we can begin that dialogue and start providing some concrete solutions. The question about legislation and next steps. Again, here I'm going to give credit to Dina Ladd and the Workers' Action Center because they've been doing some great work around this, around temp agencies. We're influential in getting some improvements in that direction. There's still a long ways to go. And I think it's particularly with temp agencies, there is a need for some type of legislative initiative. But it is possible to have precarious work and security. And I would point to the construction trades, and we have people here from the construction trades. Electricians and plumbers and whatnot, they rarely have a permanent job with one employer month to month to month. They're working on short-term contracts, and they move from job to job. And here the union has taken responsibility for providing the benefits, for providing the pensions, for regulating who gets jobs, and providing some security. And we're seeing that increasingly in the arts now as well, in the media. So there are ways to bring this kind of security to people, even if they don't have a permanent job with one employer 30 hours a week, year to year. So I think there are things that we can do that are being done. This is not impossible. Andrew asked, why did we leave out 16 to 25-year-olds and focus on 25 to 65? Well, I say our focus really was on households and community, and so we wanted to skew the sample to those groups who we felt were more likely to have started forming a household, who were engaged in their community, and who probably were through that initial, theoretically should be through that initial period of shopping around for a job and doing a temp job there before they latch on to something permanent. So that was the reason we did that. And I think those young people age 16 to 25, that's a whole other question that we need to look at. But I'd suggest that perhaps 15 years ago it would have been the 16 to 25-year-olds we should be looking at. Perhaps now it's going to be the 16 to 35-year-olds we need to look at, because this period of sort of student employment can go on for decades for many people. And we know this from some of the data being done in the United States that's showing this era of temporary work seems just to go on and on and on.
Great, thank you. I saw Beth Wilson had her hand, and she's up first again. Beth, stand up so they can find you more easily if you don't mind. And can I look over here? So Pedro's pointing to someone that I can't see. Your table, third table. Front table. Mitzi. And there's someone in the back there as well. Okay.
Beth Wilson, Social Planning Toronto, and I wanted to ask a question about your 6 categories where you have low income, precarious, low income, not precarious, or secure. Are there income differences between those two groups? If you're low income, precarious, do you have a lower income than the low income, secure? And I'm wondering, does that have anything to do with some of the outcomes? It's not only precarity, but are you in deeper poverty than people would be low income secure?
Okay, Wayne, why don't you take that while we run the mics to the other side of the room?
Okay, great. Okay, great question. We certainly have taken a preliminary look at that. That doesn't seem to be the big difference. So there's not a massive difference in the actually income of the low-income precarious, low-income secure. Where there is a huge difference is in benefits. So the low-income secure are much more likely to have some kind of benefits, a bit of a pension, than the low-income insecure. The low-income secure are more likely to be in a job they've been in for more than a year. They're more likely to have a union. They're less likely to be concerned about raising issues at the workplace. So that seems to be where really the more important differences are, rather than income. Again, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of a large database, and we will want to look at that in more detail. But our initial look, and again, there's a table in the report that tries to answer exactly that question, and you can see the difference on a number of indicators of the low-income secure versus the low-income insecure. You can see exactly where the differences are between those two groups.
Thank you. Mitzi.
Thank you, and thank you so much for how you frame this conversation around precarious work and really including such a large group of people who live in southern Ontario, southwest Ontario. I've been thinking about what I was told when I entered the workforce, which was, don't expect to have one career for one job for your entire career, and that's borne true. I'm now on my 5th. And it just seemed to be something that I accepted when I entered the labor market. And I'm wondering about the nature of work, and has the nature of work shifted? And how do we, as a society, recognize that? What are some of the macro indicators that we need to consider? So if we are having more part-time employment and precarious employment, are there more people employed net? If we create that shift, will less people be employed? And what does that bear out in terms of our economy? And because there are pressures in every sector, in the government sector, in the global markets. And I'm just wondering about what are some of the recommendations from what are the policy levers that we could pull to address this issue, but also recognizing the nature of work as well as some of the pressures that are on our economy at this time.
Thank you. That was Mitzi Hunter from Civic Action. Sorry. And Mihaela's going to go to the back, but Wayne will answer that.
It's great questions. There's nothing wrong with having multiple careers. Depends if it's your choice or someone else's choice. And I think the issue here is that a lot of people who are in precarious employment involuntarily have to end up changing careers, and they have significant gaps in between those jobs. So one of the women I spoke with yesterday on the media said, "Yeah, I had a job and then I lost it, and for 12 months I didn't have another job. Now I have another job and I love what I'm doing, but there are these gaps." And so I think that's the nature of the new labor market that we need to think about and find policies to bridge. Certainly, the reality is that most of us like to eat, and therefore most of us need to work. Those two things kind of go together. And so, participation rates, they kind of go up and down with the economic cycle, but the reality is that most people are participating in the labor market. They're taking jobs. It just seems a lot of people are taking jobs because their desire to eat is stronger than their unwillingness to take undesirable jobs. So I'm not sure that it's going to change a whole lot of participation, but what it potentially has to do is change the quality of the jobs those people participate in. And I think that's a larger question. It's hard to predict, but I don't think it's going to result in fewer people participating. And the last one is about sectors. I think the key here is that this really is in all sectors. In some ways, some of the growth sectors are the sectors where it's the most likely to be found. So this is in the knowledge sector. This is in the media. This is increasing the universities. We are doing more and more research, but the vast majority of people doing research are not people like myself who have tenured jobs. They're people who are supporting those people in tenured jobs. And so there is, for every person who's tenured, there's 10 people out there in short-term contract jobs that are doing research. And we need to think through how can we make those jobs more bearable and supportive of their families.
And I think this connects to something we were asked a lot when we were talking to people about it, was this issue of choice. whether people are choosing, or some people choosing to take a that as freelance, that as contract, and what does that mean? How do we think about that in relation to precarity? I wonder if you want to comment on that as well, as it's so related.
I mean, certainly for some people, they do choose. There's no doubt about it. They're consciously choosing not to be participating in this permanent full-time employment, which ties them down. But certainly for more than half the people who are in these positions, it's not through choice. They don't have other options. They would like something more permanent. They'd like something more stable. They don't necessarily want something full-time. But they do want something they can say, okay, I have 20 hours of work this month, and I'd like to have 20 hours of work every month for the next 5 years. And that's becoming increasingly difficult to find. So it's the whole issue of the insecurity. Not many people opt for insecurity. Some people may opt for part-time, but they don't opt for insecurity.
Thank you. So is the mic back there? Yeah. Great.
Michael Kerr, Color of Poverty, Color of Change. Wayne, you made a passing reference, I'm not sure if it was in one of the slides, but to peoples of color. So I was wondering if you might be able to unpack and say a bit more about thinking about a province that is moving ever closer to being 1/3 racialized, whether First Peoples or peoples of color, and a GTA and Hamilton moving ever closer to 50%. What is the character, what did the data reveal or suggest in terms of the disproportionate disadvantage or the differential experience of racialized groups?
The issue of race and immigration, they're hard to unpack those two issues. The evidence, I think, is absolutely clear that if you're a recent immigrant to the area, you're almost certainly to be accessing the labor market through some kind of precarious job. There's no doubt about that. The data is not longitudinal, so it's hard to say what the trend's going to be over time. But there's certainly some indicator that may be the case for 10 or 20 years before you actually get to the same probability of having a permanent job as someone who's born here in Canada. And certainly, again, for the race issue, there's certainly a higher prevalence of this kind of precarious employment amongst racialized groups. But the differences are perhaps less than we might have thought. And I think this is a reflection of the larger changes that are going on in the labor market, where more and more people, this is their only access to employment, is through precarious employment. And the loss of privilege, to be frank, of white men who in the 80s and the 90s did have access to those privileged jobs at Stelco and at Ford, and those jobs, to be frank, are disappearing. So I think the two things are happening. One is certainly this insecure employment is bearing down on people of color and immigrants, and number two, the security that white people have is evaporating, and so there's a convergence of the two.
Great. Sharon?
Sharon Simpson, Labour Community Services. Just a very brief question with regards to if the trend of precarity continues, what do we imagine the impact will be on our various communities, particularly as social services that provide services to many of these folks are themselves in some precariousness?
And Sharon, right behind you is a woman with dark hair who I can just about see.
Oh, shall I go ahead then?
Yes, please.
It's Jennifer from the Income Security Advocacy Center. I was really struck by the slide that you said that you managed to sneak in despite others' advice, that a male in insecure, that there's a relationship between a male who's in insecure employment having a partner who's likely to be unemployed. I think that's fascinating. You were making the indication that there's a causal relationship there, and I'm wondering what your data said about that causal relationship and how you explain that.
So before Wayne starts, I'm just going to say I was not the one who told him to take that slide. I was the one who kept saying, what does this slide mean? Because where's the S? Where's the apostrophe supposed to be on this slide?
Okay, so what does this mean for our communities in the long run? What does it mean for support? I think that's the right question to ask. Right? What's clear is that the model that we assumed in the 1970s and the 1980s, where families would get support through someone in a permanent full-time job, who had a job that paid benefits and a pension, that model is becoming less of a reality for more and more people. And so if it's not coming from private employers, where is it going to come from? And I think you're absolutely right to suggest that for a growing cohort of people, these kind of issues they're going to have to get support from community agencies, from the rest of our community. What we find is an increased incidence of households saying, I get support from some other household. So in some ways it's been privatized. So this is young people, perhaps as old as 35, getting support from their parents in some ways, to sometimes do as much as to put food on the table. So I think that those kind of supports are going to increase in need, and how we find them, I think, is a good question. On the issue of the causal relationship between I'm in insecure employment, that makes it more likely my partner's in insecure employment. And I think we're only beginning this, because this is one of these things that kind of pops out of the study and say, where did that come from? And so I think we need to do some more work. But I suggest to you that the slide we showed shortly after on daycare at least provides some of that answer. So I'm in insecure employment. I don't know what my work schedule is going to be. I don't know if I'm going to have a full-time job in 3 months. One of us has got to take care of the kids. And so, let's not either of us commit to anything that's too permanent. Let's not commit to a permanent daycare, because we may not be able to afford it in 3 months. And so no one's in secure employment. Or it could be as much as, I have this job here, but I may have to move from Toronto to Hamilton for my next job. And so how can my partner make a commitment here in Toronto when the whole family is going to have to be moved out to another physical location? So I think these are the kind of things that perhaps we didn't think enough about, but probably are behind this relationship between precarity is converging in the same households rather than being spread around between households where someone is in permanent employment.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions, and I've got 2 people lined up over here, and I'm really sorry for everyone else. But Wayne will, of course, be here all day, as the rest of the research team, so there'll be opportunities to talk in the lunch break, for example.
Thank you. Vivian McCaffrey from the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, and my question may not apply directly to Dr. Lewchuk's presentation, but to the report overall, but I think the report's really important and very timely. I was struck that none of the discussion at the end, and I haven't read the whole report, but these are comments on the need to really look at our tax system. And when we hear Councillor Havoc talking about contracting out jobs, because of the City of Toronto we decide we can't afford unionized jobs anymore, or you talk about the importance of childcare, but we don't have a tax system that supports them, or we don't fund universities well enough to pay for more full-time work for academics, it strikes me that your report really leads to a broader discussion about that issue that few politicians really want to wade into, and that is the need to really have a constructive discussion about how, given we have a wealthier society, as you pointed out, than we had decades ago, but it's not really being equally shared, why aren't we talking about a much more progressive tax system?
If you could hand that to Emily. Emily Adzi from University of Toronto. And my question builds on a couple that have been posed. I really appreciate the acknowledgement of gender, and particularly of the fact that for women, precarious employment has been the norm or the situation throughout women's broad-scale involvement in the labor market. And I was also interested in the echoes in your report to feminist work on provisioning labor, and the idea that the work that goes into maintaining a household, and you have a household focus in the study, goes beyond the paid employment that puts food on the table and pays the bills, but that there is childcare, there's involvement in the community, that there's building of informal networks of support and friendship. And so I'm interested to hear a little more on what emerges in terms of recommendations and overlap there around the importance of provisioning labor and the ways in which that is balanced with or played off against employment security, and what are some of the options for addressing that conflict? Thank you.
I mean, I think I can actually take both questions because they're of the same genre, and so let me do that. Again, I think that the point I keep stressing as an economist, we're richer today than we were 10 years ago, so what's going on? Why are so many people feeling worse off given that we're a richer society? And certainly some of the solution can be through a tax system which allows the city to employ its people on a permanent basis in unionized jobs. But also I think this issue that Evelyn's raising of all the other supports that we need around child care. I mean, we can afford these things. We are a wealthier society, and I think the problem is we have been so fixated on solving the competitive pressures that employers are facing, which are real. I don't think we should ignore those. That we have lost sight of the bigger debate that this should be about making a better society. And this should be supporting our households, supporting our communities. And we are all going to be poorer if our households start falling apart and if our community falls apart. And I think that's, if anything, I think that's what we'd like to get the debate going. Do we have all the solutions yet? No, but hopefully we'll have another meeting like this in 2 years with Maple Leaf Gardens. We'll have 5,000 people here with placards, and we'll take to the streets and we'll fix the problem.
Good. Thank you, Wayne.
That was the McMaster University Not United Way position.
Thank you. Thank you all. Such great questions, really helping us think more in more detail around where we need to go next. And we look forward to the rest of the day. It will continue to be a very high level of discussion. So thank you all very much indeed. And I'll hand over to Stephanie, who will introduce the next segment.